Okay, just checking if the sound is okay. So, began the recording. Today we are looking at the fourth game of the tournament. I actually tried to record the video of this game multiple times, but I find that it's really difficult to speak about this game in a somewhat entertaining fashion just because it's such a long game. It was really difficult to stay focused in the game while it was happening. So if you remember, I won the two first games of the tournament without too much trouble, and the third game I drew after some trouble against a lower rated opponent. So in this game, I go up against I think the not the lowest, sorry, a pretty low rated opponent for me. He's 1680, I think, but he did tell me after the game that his peak rating was 2000 something. He's stronger than his rating, but anyway, the game posed some really interesting challenges for me. Let's take a look. So I was black. I tried, because of the trouble I've had in the previous game in the opening, I wanted to be better prepared, but I couldn't find my opponent's games or information anywhere. I ended up not knowing the line to its full extent anyways. Like, it's a complicated line and I don't think I've ever played it, but I ended up coming okay out of the opening. Played e4, I played e5, knight f3, knight c6. This is all standard stuff, just king's pawn opening. And he goes with the Scotch opening, d4. I played the Scotch before, I'm well aware of the theory. I take on e5, knight takes, and here I played bishop to c5. I played knight to f6, the main move as well. This time I choose to play bishop to c5, and my opponent plays knight to b3. Tiny subtlety, it's not that big of a deal, but I don't know this move at that point when I played the game. I've never encountered it. Just going back to attack the bishop, I wasn't really that impressed, but because I feel like the knight belongs in the center and it's way better to play the main line, which is bishop to e3, queen to f6, and c3, maintaining the strong knight in the center. When the knight goes to the queen side, I can sort of dictate matters and the knight can be kind of the poor piece. I mean, after the next move, bishop to b6, the knight doesn't seem that impressive. It has no forward squares right now, but I do see the appeal. Maybe going to push a4 in the future, maybe castling queenside and banking on the knight as a defensive piece. My opponent played knight to c3, and as I mentioned, I don't really know this setup for white. I do know, as I said before, bishop to e3 and queen to f6. So I felt very comfortable with the queen on f6 in Scotch positions. So I decided to go to f6 anyways, threatening a mate in 1. Note that the knight can jump to d5. That's a resource that I would need to keep in mind as the game progresses, right? Because that would be a very powerful jump, hitting c7, hitting b6, hitting the queen. My opponent first of all defends against the mate threat on f2 with queen to e2, and I play knight to e7 to stop the threat of the knight. Now go ahead and take a small calculation in your mind, like, does knight d5 here for white do him any good? Like, is that a good move? The answer is, you can pause the video, sorry, I don't want to rush you or anything. The answer is that it doesn't lead to anything conclusive, and for a few moves up ahead, we both keep the tension with knight to d5. I mean, it's always an option for him, and my king is also always, like, not always, but for the next few moves, the king is going to remain in the sight of the queen, and knight to d5 never works. But this is something to take note of in your games, like, does this still work? And I need to calculate it every single move. So right now, if my opponent plays knight d5, he's attacking f6, the queen, e7, the knight, and b6, the bishop. If I take, my opponent takes back with check, attacking the knight, but I do have the saving grace knight to e7. This move would have been nice if I had to take with a pawn, but I don't. I can take with the queen. So otherwise my opponent cannot attack this knight any further, and I'm going to castle, and my opponent just weakened his pawn and lost a valuable knight, while my knight was doing nothing on e7, so it's not a worthwhile tactic. But as I said, we do need to keep an eye out for that now that the queen and king are still aligned. So my opponent played bishop to e3 to stop the influence of the bishop, and if I take his bishop on e3, he captures back with his queen, and his light squared bishop is free to roam the board. So I don't capture, I tell him go ahead and capture the bishop on my terms and open up the a file for me. I would be happy to see that happen. My I played d6, once again calculating and deciding that knight to d5 does not come with a significant threat. Same reason as before, knight to e7, capture of the bishop does not matter. Note that if the knight moves away now, let's say to b4, then bishop takes b6 comes with check and I lose the piece. So anyways, knight to d5 still doesn't work. My opponent decides to castle queenside. And his setup is actually pretty good now, I would say about equal, because these knights are very strong defenders of his king, and this knight isn't so bad as a defender, and a lot of his pieces are pointed at the center, like they are very well developed and placed, while I have somewhat of a lacking presence in the center. Not an advantage for white in any way, but he does have a very comfortable game right now. I decided to play bishop to d7, sort of hinting at maybe I'm going to castle queenside, let's see. And as I mentioned before, once again, I've looked and calculated knight to d5, but sorry about that. But in this case, in this move specifically, my opponent had miscalculated knight to d5, so he plays it. Now my opponent did not think that knight to d5 wins a piece. At the very least, I can take the bishop on e3 with check and then take the knight and go with the same plan, right? Knight takes, pawn takes, and knight to e7. My opponent had calculated that at the end of many variations, he can play rook to e1, and then I can't castle, and the knight is pinned, and it takes a long while for me to unwind. I would have to play something like king to f8 to maintain the defense of the knight, while taking my king away from the center and maybe castle by hand, right? What my opponent had missed, of course, is that another move order can be employed in order to avoid all of that from happening. I can take the knight first, go knight to, that's exactly what happened in the game actually, take the knight on d5, my opponent takes back with the pawn, we still must block the e-file, because if we don't, the bishop will take on b6 with check. I decide not to go with knight to e5 because of bishop takes b6, a takes b6, and f4, but f4 doesn't work. I actually miscalculated. In my calculations, the bishop was still on e3, but actually that was a viable move. Maybe not if my opponent plays f4 first. Then yeah, I think that would be problematic, because now I have to move my knight preemptively, you know. That's actually an interesting tactic, that he has to note that he should play f4 first and not take the bishop. Anyways, I did not see that, and I did this, actually, I'm sorry, I did see that knight to e5 does not work. I decided to go knight to e7. My opponent took on b6, once again counting on the fact that next move he's going to have rook to e1 to put pressure on my knight. The problem is that when I force my opponent, I don't take on e3, I force my opponent to exchange on my terms and open up the a file, an issue arises for him. Let's see that. A takes b6, and now let's say my opponent goes ahead with his plan, with the plan that he had before, rook to e1, rook takes a2. Not only is the knight well defended, but now his king is in trouble. He cannot defend, sorry, that's not a threat. He needs to defend the b2 pawn. If he plays c3, I am ecstatic about my position, absolutely beautiful. This rook is incredibly powerful, and I would have no trouble going with king to d8 or something to try and bring my rook to the e file, my king is perfectly safe, and this rook is perfectly active. I won a pawn for nothing, and I still have an attack on his king. So now that my opponent saw that the a2 pawn hangs and this combination only served to weaken his d5 pawn, he decides to stay clear of that, plays king to b1 to prevent the threat of rook to a2, but now his problem is that I managed to castle kingside, and I will tell you guys about opposite sides castling positions. Those are very interesting positions, and they can be very difficult to play. So usually, like if my king was on the queen side, if my king was on c8 or b8, I wouldn't want to open up. I wouldn't be glad about this open a file, for example. It makes my king weaker. Same for my opponent, right? If he was on the king side, if the king was on g1, he wouldn't want to go h4 or g4. When the kings are on opposite sides of the board, you can throw the kitchen sink at your opponent's king and basically open up that side of the board with reckless abandon without worrying too much about the safety of your own king. You do need to take other factors into account. You can't just sacrifice pawns usually. You need to calculate things thoroughly. But that's basically the idea. Like right now, it's less about strategical weaknesses, although that is still very important. It's more about who can get to the opponent's king faster. So I have a clear advantage right now because of that combination that did not work for white. Because I have an open a file towards his king, and my king is perfectly safe, and it's a long way. It's a long time before he manages to get any activity. So realizing that, my opponent went with queen to d2, preparing to play bishop to d3 and activate some of his undeveloped pieces, and then maybe try to pawn storm my king or defend the queen side in which his king currently resides. I play rook to a4, preparing to double and take advantage of this open a file, f3, both preventing the f2 pawn from being taken in case the queen ever moves, and preparing g4 in some cases. To kickstart the attack on my king, I played rook to a8, the other rook, to double my rooks and complete the maneuver, although knight to c1 right now leaves my rooks kind of not really doing much, although I did have the wonderful move rook to a5, which I'd missed, or rook 8 to a5 in order to attack the very weak pawn, and my opponent would have to play something like c4, which weakens his king greatly, and now this bishop can finally find his home on f5, and the attack on the king is becoming more powerful by the moment. Like every move, it's just better for me and worse for my opponent. But I missed that. I actually missed a very important threat that my opponent, a very big threat that my opponent had. I did realize though that the best move would be in some way involving these pieces that are currently doing nothing. I didn't want to play bishop to f5 right away because I didn't like bishop to b5 as a response, which kind of activates the bishops and has the potential to block my rooks completely. I'm not sure if that would be great for white. Maybe I can sacrifice at some point. This is a very strong bishop and a very annoying one that's difficult to kick out, and now I have no access to the d5 pawn. So I decided, okay, this knight has no... I missed the importance of the knight pressuring the d5 pawn. I said to myself, this knight has no future on c6, on c1, so I should bring it to the center, aim it at the e5 square. So that's exactly what I did. Knight to g6, kind of a long maneuver, which is exactly the weakness. So white has a combination here. Now I gave up my advantage. I had a not a significant advantage, but one that is very difficult to maintain. But this turns out to be a very bad move. It just gives away the advantage that I had for absolute equality. Because of a two-move sequence, first of all, b3, rook goes back to a5, and queen to d4. offering the queen trade, I have no decent way to avoid the queen trade. I wouldn't want to go to e7 and inconvenience the queen, or go like the queen is doing nothing on g5 except being a target for the pawn storm that's coming. So, by the way, the reason that knight to g6 was so bad, because if the knight was still on e7 at this point, my opponent would not have queen to d5 because I would be able to take here, right? So it turns out after I analyzed the game that knight to g6 was actually one of the few moves that don't maintain the advantage. Even h6, a move that does nothing, is still better because b3, rook to a5, and now my opponent is looking at once again the threat against the d5, the weak d5 pawn, and he would have to either develop his bishop passively, at which point I would have the ability to push my pawns or to activate my own bishop, or c4, which weakens his pawns tremendously, and I would very much enjoy playing this position. So knight to g6 turned out to be a significant mistake. It's one of the only moves that basically prevent that resource that I just showed you from being relevant. So now my opponent does have this sort of tactical sequence to trade the queens by force. I took the queen on d4, my opponent took back, and now I had evaluated that this is completely equal. I have no advantage to speak of, but I also remember thinking, well, this is a very difficult position for me to play. My rooks right now are doing nothing. They are both staring at a well-defended pawn. Whereas before, with the queen on the board, maybe I could have sacrificed at some point. Maybe my queen could have gotten involved. But with my two remaining pieces far off the queen side, I don't see how they get there anytime soon. These rooks are doing nothing. So my rooks are doing nothing on the A file. I need to bring them back. I also need to bring back my knight, right? My knight is doing nothing on g6 as well, because with this rook move, both of these forward squares are blocked. The e5 square, I guess I should have seen that before as well. The e5 square isn't that impressive because of white's pawn formation. This square, like all of these forward moves, are blocked because of white's pawns. So, an admission of defeat, that the last few moves weren't that good for me. I went back with the knight to e7 to attack the d5 pawn once again, and to try to organize my forces and bring the knight to a more civilized square, like f5 maybe. That would be pretty powerful. My opponent played c4, defending the pawn. Now that's not weakening at all. He doesn't mind the open diagonal once again because the queen is not on the board. I played h5, both aimed at trying to stop g4 if my opponent attempts it, because an attack on my king when my pieces are so far off from defending it is not that crazy of an idea. He might still play g4 and try to attack. And also to give my king some luft, right? So one day any rook that comes to e8 does not checkmate my king. My opponent played bishop to d3. I played king to f8. Trying to preemptively, like I saw that my opponent was hoping to play rook to e1 and rook to e4, and I wanted to defend the knight, defend a rook that's going to come to e8. So if you can imagine, like if I play something like this, we can see rook to e1, rook to e8, rook to e4, and I guess it's just a transposition, but suddenly white has a lot of pressure on the open file. So I went with king to f8, just avoiding any back rank checkmates once again, because the bishop was now blocking my escape square. Rook to e1 as predicted, rook to e8, also trying to free up this rook because the a8 rook was blocking my other rook from coming back to life, basically, right? So rook to e8. Once again, white is still, by the way, sorry for saying once again so much. I truly gained a big amount of appreciation for YouTubers and streamers who speak English as a second language. I found out how difficult it can be to speak for so long and so eloquently. By the way, during a lot of these moves, I do wonder, and I did calculate about like the move b5 as an option, but I decided that after pawn takes, bishop takes, b5, bishop takes, rook takes, this rook has no targets, but I did create a backwards pawn on an open file. So I did not like this at all, not right away, because that hangs a pawn. But basically, I did not like the long-term factor of putting this pawn on a weak square, and I felt like this, the d5 pawn is going to be less of a weakness. I might have been mistaken because right now it seems pretty annoying for white to deal with, but I didn't like it at the time. Maybe white has some other response. I'm unsure. So rook to e8, and now my opponent played g4, as I mentioned, trying to attack my king. I took on g4 because I don't really have another option. I wouldn't want to weaken to get a weak h5 pawn or anything. I wouldn't want to push because that's just going to get captured. I mean, I can defend the pawn right now, but it's not a long-term defense. So I'm basically by saying, like, taking off the other options, I can say, okay, taking is the only good move. Note that the pawn is defended, so I cannot take again. Lateral defense can be pretty difficult to see for newer players. Actually, for every player, like long lateral defense of rooks or queens or stuff like that. And now rook to a8, and my forces are sorry. Finally, back in the game. The rooks are back. The rook is back where it started at the beginning of the game, where it wanted to go for so long. My opponent decided to change direction. I actually really like this move, and it's not a move that I thought he's going to play. I thought he was going to play rook to e4 to increase the pressure on the e file, but now that the a8 rook is there, the d7 bishop is there, the e file pressure amounts to nothing, right? The knight, sorry about that. The knight can be, the knight is already defended twice. It can only be attacked twice, and the rook is defended basically almost with every single piece that I have. So it was very wise of my opponent to recognize that the completely open file is of no use to him and go for the half open file and attack my weak f pawn. So rook to f1, attacking the f pawn. And I recognized my opponent's plan. It was basically now double on the f file. If I ever try to play f6, like let's look at some random moves. Let's imagine this is a path move, like I'm not really moving the pawn here. So my opponent plays rook to f4, rook to f4, pawn to f6, and now pawn to g5 to break down the barrier and win a pawn by force, and also gain an attack on my king. So I cooked up some response. I saw that I could basically use my knight as a blockader, either. So my move was knight to g8, and if we look at the same line, we can see that now my knight defends the f6 square, and I can take back with the knight or with the pawn. It's completely fine. It's not completely fine. My king is very weak, and some bishop to g6 is going to just ruin my day completely, right? It's a very difficult position to play when you have so many weaknesses and your pieces are still not active. And this can actually show us how a slight miscalculation, the one I had where I played knight to g6, can have long-lasting effects. White had a lot of activity, and I had to struggle and move my pieces back. This is not what my opponent played, but my opponent decided to play bishop to g6, recognizing that the pawn is pinned to my king. I cannot take the bishop, and he's attacking the pawn another time. I can defend the pawn with rook to e7, but that would just invite some more pressure on the pawn. I decided to play what I think, if I remember correctly, I did analyze this with the engine. I remember that the move that I played is the only way to equality right here. So white has an advantage. I'm not sure about that. You can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. So knight to f6, attacking the bishop, because now the pin is no more, and telling white you can go ahead and play g5, right, to take the knight, but now it's just a complicated trade. King to g7, I activated my king just a little bit more, and the rook is going to, the activity of the rooks is nothing. Actually, sorry, you can just play bishop to f5 and win an exchange at the very least. If he plays the wrong move, bishop rook to f4, so probably rook to f2 is what I would have seen if my opponent decided to go there. So this is such a powerful move that gives equality back to me because it comes with so many threats, and my opponent basically has to give away his very powerful bishop for this kind of weak knight so far, right? Like the knight just went from g. It's kind of funny. The knight went from g8 to e7 to g6 to e7 to g8 and now to f6. So the knight filled a very defensive, passive role during the game, while this bishop was very powerful. First of all, taking away the escape square for my king, right now attacking a very weak pawn. So I managed to almost almost force white to trade it. It's forced, by the way, because the pawn is also attacked for a second time, so this move is really a wonderful move that comes with a lot of threats. My opponent decided to take on f7 and kind of put a twist on the move that I mentioned before, playing g5 right away. Take on f7, I take back, and now my king is not on g8 and the pawn is not on f6, that's the difference. Not sure if that matters that much. I'm going to win a pawn back so I don't lose a pawn. I decided to activate my rook, and also this decision came from calculation. I decided that I don't want to give white the passed h pawn. I want to keep my pawn on the g file because white's rooks, both of them, are so much more active than mine. I want to maintain my pawn as a pawn that can stop white's h pawn. I don't want it to be passed. I feel like that would be a bad time for me. So basically, you might be asking, well, how does that work? How is that even slightly related to what you just said? I'll show you, because I want to take on f6 with my king, and in order to do that, I need to block the check, block the rook's influence. So it helps me, by the way, in other factors, right? I can just activate my bishop. So that's eventually the point, to activate my bishop with check. We will see king to b2, and then I can take on f6 with the king. By the way, again, the same deal with b5. Actually, during all of these last moves, it just opens up a file towards my weak c7 pawn, and I feel like that's a terrible pawn to lose, so I don't want to play b5 at any point. Although, just like I said before, I'm rethinking some of these decisions. Maybe b5 was better during some of these moves, but I'm very proud of the way that I played this section of the game. Rook to e5, my opponent took, and I played bishop to f5, exactly as I said. King to b2, and king takes f6 to maintain. By the way, the pawn being on the g file helps also in solidifying this very powerful bishop. Then knight on c1, that was an important defensive piece in the earlier middle game, is now kind of doing nothing. While my bishop, they can be compared, right? The two remaining minor pieces in the game. So my bishop is the powerful one slicing through white's position, while white's knight is kind of confused. You know, it had a role to fulfill earlier in the game. It just remained on that post and is doing nothing ever since. So both of our kings are just a little bit closer to the center with these last few moves. My opponent played rook to f2, sensing exactly what I just said, that the knight is doing nothing. My opponent wants to move the knight while guarding the e2 infiltration square of my rook. So if my opponent tries to move the knight right away, just rook to e2, and it's going to be a bad time on the second rank. So rook to f2, very good prophylactic thinking, trying to prevent my threats. And I played g6, defending both the pawn and the bishop, so the pin is less important. Now we see knight to d3, better than before. Now I don't have rook to e2. And I go forward with rook to e3, putting pressure on the knight. The rook is sort of trapped, and not a big deal, right? The rook can always move, and the knight can move very soon, but trying to find the most active square for my rook, maybe aiming to go to h3, keeping the possibility of doubling rooks. It's a nice square to be on, e3. My opponent did in fact go for knight to f5, knight to f4, sorry, trying to activate, maybe sinking the knight on to e6 in the future, and in general just trying to keep the knight very strong and safe. And I decided to go with king to e5, heading straight into danger, just putting my king in the center, attacking this undefended rook at the moment, and the rook will have to retreat. So we see rook to d2. My king is kind of vulnerable here. We will see that coming up, but it's a calculated risk. Like the position is still equal, basically in every move of this endgame. I activated my other rook with rook to h8. Looking at the only weak pawn that white has, it's not weak because it's currently defended by two rooks, but it's good to put your rooks on such squares anyways, right? Because the rooks will have to, the opponent will have to think twice about moving these rooks and activating along my 7th rank one day, if that will be a possibility. We see knight to g2. I can take the pawn because my rook is hanging, so I have to take my rook back. And now h4. So using the knight to defend his weak h pawn, basically saying, okay, if you're going to keep your rook on the h file, a knight is going to negate your rook, 3 points versus 5. But I did like this turn of events because I felt like my bishop can one day disturb the knight, and white will have no easy way of defending the h5 pawn. So I felt like that pawn, although it's currently defended well, it might be weak one day. I played rook to h7 first. Because of that exact thought process, what went through my mind is, well, if I play bishop to h3 right now, my opponent can just go to the 7th rank, and winning the h5 pawn is suddenly not that impressive. My opponent takes, I take, and my opponent takes on c7, and you can try and evaluate yourself. Which pawn do you think is more important, white's h4 pawn or my c7 pawn? I'm going to tell you that the answer is the c7 pawn is way more important. Now I have 3 very weak pawns that are very easy to capture, and 2 of them are attacked, so I'm going to lose another pawn in the following move. So seeing all of that, I decided to play rook to h7, stopping white's infiltration point right away and preparing bishop to h3. My opponent brought his king further into the center. A good move, also taking away some squares for my king if the rook decides to do something else. And now I played the move that I prepared for earlier, bishop to h3. And by the way, I should say that I did miscalculate, and we will see why. My opponent saw farther than me at this point. My opponent recognized that me taking the knight and then capturing here is not that great. I mean, so obviously right away, right after white, this is the move that white played, a4. Obviously right away, I can just defend the pawn in some way. I decided to go with the rook. Note that white's pawn is still attacked twice. So if you were thinking like, okay, take the pawn, but white takes yours, but the thing is, I don't have to take right away. This pawn is a goner. I can just go back and take and then defend my weak pawn first, which is exactly what I decided to do. The thing is that the pressure on the g6 pawn is going to be overwhelming because I need to take off one of my rooks from the defense of the g6 pawn in order to capture the pawn. We'll see exactly why. Rook to h6, defending. Rook to f2, basically asking me, well, you put this rook on h7 in the first place to guard against 7th rank infiltration, so now I can just infiltrate. By the way, just now remembering, I think that at this point I'm going to check one moment. I seem to remember that this point is the one, yeah, when white had a massive advantage. So white could infiltrate along the 8th rank. Why is that so good? So let's say I take, capture, and rook back here. Yeah, so rook to h6 once again to defend the pawn is a massive mistake because of checkmate in 1. And if I take the pawn, well, that's not any good. Like rook to e2 is the best move, that's fine, but I don't see any reason not to do something like just taking the pawn, and his rooks are sorry about my coughing. My opponent's rooks are way more active than mine. He's going to win the b7 pawn very soon. I have no way to protect that pawn, and all of white's pawns can be easily guarded, very easily. Both me and my opponent have missed this resource. The engine lines are way more impressive than my evaluation. So the rook and this king are all preventing my king's escape, so I need to make some room and take with the right rook, or just king to b4, sorry. Play some very precise moves, some very precise endgame moves, which are some of the most difficult positions to play. So, as I mentioned, we both missed that. I'm going to turn off the engine for the rest of the analysis. I just think it's better that way. So neither of us has an easy out, right? So we need to evaluate the position truly. I defended. Note that the f4 square is the king's escape square. Sorry, the f file in general is the king's escape square. So rook to g5 is no longer, sorry, not no longer. It's not currently a checkmate threat. My opponent changes that with rook to f2. So now rook to g5 is a checkmate threat. And if I decide to take the pawn with the wrong rook, I get checkmated. He actually asked me after the game, like, did I notice that it could have been just checkmate in 1 if I took with the wrong rook, and I told him I did. Instead of the rook to f2, I give my king a square by playing rook e takes. Rook e takes e4, takes h4, sorry. And rook checks once again, and my king has to go forward. I don't really like how I played this section of the game. Maybe I should have just kept my rook here and played less ambitiously. Like just allowing the trade of pawns might have been better. Some kind of perpetual or trading a pair of rooks. Because with the following few moves, my opponent makes my king passive. It might seem active because the king is in the center, but the action is not in the center, right? The action is on the queen side, and I'm blocked off the queen side by his king and his pawns. So I can't go here, can't go here, and can't go here. So his king is way more active, having direct access to my pawns very soon. Not that he can go any further then, but he can break through with some well-timed pawn move. My opponent attacked the pawn, and he's guaranteed to win the pawn back. He checked his king and he went to b4. I did not realize that this is where his king wants to be, and I tried at this point to attack the b3 pawn, which I consider to be weak. In retrospect, it's not a weak pawn. You can at any point play rook to b2, which is passive but defends the pawn perfectly well, and both rooks doubled on the third rank won't do anything. I had misevaluated that plan while in the game, although I must say that this portion of the game, it's been probably about 4 hours since we began the game. It's a 90 minutes plus 30-second increment, and my opponent for the last like 20 moves has been had like 30 seconds on his clock. He's like playing off of the increment. and he's playing very well off of the increment, right? He hasn't blundered anything, and the only one who had the advantage is him during that one point when he could infiltrate the 8th rank. It's a very frustrating thing to see during a classical game of yours. Like your opponent is playing very fast, very well, and during a very long game, it can be absolutely exhausting to play such a long game, and it can really affect your decision making. So you should take that into account when you plan to go to a classical tournament. Eat well before your tournament game, sleep well before you go to your tournament game, and try to keep in mind during the game. Like, I know it's been a long game, but just maintaining a high awareness and energy level during this game could be the differentiator, different, differentiating, sorry, the different, I don't know how to say that word, the important factor that will determine who wins the game. Like, the player who will be active and still making good moves after 2, 3, 4 hours is the person who's going to come out on top. But I was definitely feeling very fatigued, and my plans weren't very thought out. I was also getting very low on time, not as bad as my opponent, but I was on the single digit minutes. So rook to f3, as I said, trying to double in the 3rd rank, kind of an erroneous and silly plan, but I did not see that and I did not evaluate it correctly during the game. Here, probably best is just to trade rooks, to take off a pair of rooks and guarantee a draw, because white's king is more active, but I still played for a win because I knew that my opponent was low rated. A bad decision on my part. I decided to keep the rook on the board and double on the 3rd rank, and now we see check. My king goes to d3 and preventing the infiltration of my king, which would basically guarantee a draw because I can triple up on the b3 pawn and my opponent would have to check, right? So my king has to go back, and now rook to b2. I go back to defend the 2nd rank with rook to f7, the 7th rank, sorry, because I recognize now that my rooks are doing nothing on the 3rd rank, and both rooks are being negated by a single rook, just like I mentioned before with the knight, right? When both rooks are doing a task and only one rook is defending that threat, then that's not a good situation for your rooks to be in. My opponent went to the 8th rank, the threat that he didn't see before. He did manage to see it now, I didn't. And I try to bring my king closer to the action. It's a very difficult feat to accomplish right now, right? Because I don't see how my king gets anywhere. I think this was the last chance for me to maintain equality with something like f6, and I do lose a pawn. I don't remember exactly how. I think he takes, and rook to b8, and I don't see how I defend this pawn. I I lose a pawn, but I remember that somehow this is way better than what I played, which is king to e5, trying to bring my king back. My plan was basically, I saw that my opponent is going to take on b7. I wanted to play rook to d7, rook to h8, and to try and claim that his rook is trapped. That's not a good plan, but I realized that I'm in a dire situation and I couldn't see the way out. Maybe because of my exhaustion, maybe I wasn't as good at endgames as I am now, but my play could definitely improve at this point in the endgame. Rook to b8, rook to d7, rook to d7, by the way, so that after rook takes b7, my king can go back without blocking the rook's defense, and the opponent can take on c7 with check. Rook takes b7 and rook to h8, trying to trap the rook, but of course that's not even a pawn sacrifice. My opponent just is breaking up my pawns and is currently up a pawn, so the rook is going to go free. I must take, and basically I'm going to just scroll through some of these moves. My opponent's king gets very active and my king is still locked out of the game. I don't want to do the mistakes that I did in the last game. Basically in this game I tried very hard to to prevent the conversion of this position. The king is very active and I can't do anything. I must give up another pawn. So I'm not going to analyze every step of the conversion. Like he played very well, and I tried to see if I could maybe squeeze a draw out of a dead lost position. At the end of the game, my opponent managed to force a rook trade. After I tried to say like, okay, you can take on d6, and then I take this check, and maybe I can do something, but my opponent just forces a rook trade, and the game is done. I encountered my first loss again against an opponent that was 300 rate points lower than an opponent that I won against in the second round. It's a difficult thing to bounce back from, but I did play some good games in the following games in the tournament. So an unfortunate conclusion, but it was still a very impressive game. We remained last in the tournament. My opponent left and said like, "Oh, that's the first time you were last in the tournament hall." He said he does that every game. Like he has time trouble issues. He also always goes to his last second, and he always plays very long games. That must be absolutely exhausting. But we went to the bus stop together and we analyzed the game blindly. It was very nice, a very nice thing to do, even though I lost. It's always more pleasant to lose to a man, to a person that is pleasant and nice and is willing to talk about the game with you. So, an unfortunate conclusion, but not a terrible one. I enjoyed this game. I did play well again. Some, I learned some lessons about like don't make automatic moves, right? Like the move of knight to g6, just resting on my laurels and thinking like, well, my position is good. I don't need to calculate. I'll just improve a piece. Don't make automatic moves like that, even if you're in a slightly better position. Even if you're in a one position, always try to look at your opponent's threats and try to maintain an active mindset in the end game. Like try to keep the threats going, keep yourself active, and think actively about your position. So thank you for watching. I'm trying to improve with every single video that I make. I'm trying to keep it also at a minimum of a video a week. I'm kind of struggling with that, but I think I'll manage to keep it at that pace. So thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment if you have anything to say about the game, if you had a similar experience with long games or tournament games in general. And I'll see you next week.